It is apparent to me and anyone who lives in Eastern Europe that Russian is a lingua franca, and this is not very surprising to anyone who has studied the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Centuries of Russian rule has led to the Russian language being enforced on the local populations. English is a lingua franca of the world, but what separates English dominance from Russian dominance is that there are no primarily English-speaking settlements in Turkey or France, but Eastern Europe has many local Russian populations. Eastern Europe has been Russified, therefore the country has a perpetual interest in these lands since ethnic Russians live there, and this is by design. Russia has been moving ethnic Russians to these lands in order to have a justification for conflict, liberation of these titular peoples. There have definitely been empires in the past that have had a big linguistic impact on their minority groups, but the way Russia has Russified Eastern Europe is unique to Eastern Europe, and this is what we will look into. The country that has been beat up the most by Russification is Belarus, or as many people call it, Belarusia. Belarus actually just means White Russia. During World War II, Belarus lost a third of its entire population, making the SSR susceptible to Russification. Russians moved into the cities like Minsk and Grodno, while the rural population declined. This led to Russian becoming the sole language in the cities, and the native Belarusians in the rural areas were encouraged to move into the cities where they fully integrated into Russian. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, with Belarus becoming independent not long afterwards, on August 25, 1991, its sole language becoming Belarusian. This was ratified in its 1994 constitution. However, a year later, in 1995, there was a referendum to make Belarus a bilingual country, with 83% of its population voting yes to Russian. In the 2009 census, they found out that 70% of Belarusians speak Russian at home, increasing from 58.6% in 1995. Support for the Belarusian language has been on a slow decline since 1994, and the future for the language looks bleak. Even though the Belarusian and Russian languages appear to have an equal status, the reality is that most media is consumed in Russian, and it's also the primary language of commerce, with Belarusian being pushed farther to the fringes. Today, being able to speak Belarusian is more of a badge of ethnicity, with the preferred language for 78% of Belarusians being Russian, and 98%, that's 98% of its entire population having competence in Russian. Belarus today is a pseudo-colony of Russia, with the majority of its population speaking Russian, and Belarus being too weak to defend itself from Russian advances. It wouldn't be a huge claim to say that Belarus is a colony of Russia. Or maybe a better comparison would be that Belarus is a dominion of Russia, as Canada was once a dominion of Britain. Not allowed to conduct foreign policy, but with internal affairs being regulated by the mother country. Not surprisingly, the man who facilitated the half-colonization of Belarus is also the man who facilitated the referendum to make Belarus a bilingual country, and his name is Alexander Lukashenko, the current president of Belarus, who was elected in 1994. A more accurate title for him would be colonial governor. Although I present this as a bad thing, the people of Belarus have had a very close relationship with Russia. It's not too far off to say that Belarus may become integrated into Russia. Ukraine is a truly bilingual country. Almost everywhere in the country, the people will be able to speak both Russian and Ukrainian. It is important to note that the Ukrainian language has had a much bigger range in the past than it does today, having been spoken all the way down to the Caucasus. Between 1932 and 1933, the Soviet Union produced a man-made famine in eastern Ukraine and the North Caucasus region that was specifically designed to kill ethnic minorities, specifically ethnic Ukrainians. This event is often called the Holodomor. About 10 to 20 million Ukrainians died in the famine. There are people who deny this, but as it stands right now, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time in this video proving that it did happen. Maybe I'll argue with some of these guys in the comments and I'll make a video on it another day. If the Holodomor hadn't occurred, there would be far less ethnic Russians in Ukraine and even less Ukrainian Russophones. The majority of eastern Ukraine speaks Russian primarily, and the current war in Ukraine, which was started in 2014, and continues to this day, was started by ethnic Russians who were trying to separate from Ukraine. Crimea is the most Russified part of Ukraine, or maybe Russia. Would you call a Russian state Russified if it spoke Ukrainian in the past? Well, Crimea was technically annexed by Russia, but many people still consider it Ukraine. Regardless, 73% of its residents speak Russian primarily, with 90% of kids being educated in Russian. But in Ukraine, Russian is still dominant in pop culture, industry, commerce, and literature, despite best efforts from the Ukrainian government to push this away. Ukrainian is the sole language of Ukraine, with Russian being a recognized minority language, which is kind of odd when 83% of your entire population speaks Russian. Even though Ukrainian is the sole language, the two languages are relatively equal, with Ukrainian slowly becoming the preferred language of all her citizens. As a general rule for Ukraine, most cities, Kiev, Odessa, Cherkasy, and so on, prefer to use Russian, while the more rural areas and most of western Ukraine speaks Ukrainian preferentially. Lviv is the only large city in Ukraine which uses Ukrainian preferentially. Lviv is also considered a nationalist stronghold, which is sort of funny considering that it was only 80 years ago a Polish-speaking city. Business meetings in Ukraine are sometimes conducted in both Ukrainian and in Russian, with each party having the expectation that they are proficient in both languages. A big reason why Russian is still spoken in the cities is because Soviet culture dictated that languages like Ukrainian and Belarusian were backwards, barbarian languages, while Russian was the language of progress. Therefore, when people moved into the cities, they adopted the better-seeming Soviet culture and thus began speaking Russian preferentially. Belarus has taken the approach of fully integrating Russian into their society, and Ukraine has made the choice of balancing Russian and Ukrainian. But on the other hand, you have Moldova going full Chad mode and destroying Russian influence wherever they find it. Previously, I thought that Transnistria, this tiny sliver of a state, was some sort of communist breakaway from Moldova, but Transnistria is actually an ethnic Russian enclave that broke away from Moldova because they were beating their asses. Vladimir Voronin, that's how you say his name, Vladimir Voronin, who was elected president of Moldova in 2001, tried to solve some of these problems by making Russian the second national language, but the Moldovan people were so based that they stopped their president. Moldova has made a great amount of effort to push Russian away from daily life, and it appears to be working. I don't have up-to-date 2019 statistics, but Moldova is making big gains and Russian speakers are having major anxiety. Moldovan is once again the sole language of Moldova, with Russian losing its status. Surprisingly enough, while 83% of Ukrainians are competent in Russian, anywhere from 67 to 87% of Moldovans are competent in Russian, meaning that Moldova could have a higher proportion of its population speaking Russian, but unlike Ukraine, is not a bilingual country. A big reason why Moldova was able to enforce its own language is because it has a lower percentage of Russian inhabitants than other post-Soviet states, Russians making up only 4% of the population, while Ukraine has 17% and Belarus has 8%. I did refer to Moldovan as its own language, but it is mutually intelligible with Romanian, with very few differences between the two. It is more accurate to describe Moldovan as a dialect of Romanian, same as how the differences between Standard German and Austrian German present themselves. Because of this, a supporting factor to the re-emergence of Moldovan is Romanian media. This is what separates Belarusian, where it is a small language with no outside support, while Moldovan has plenty of Romanian media to draw on without resorting to Russian. Now on to the Baltic states. Going north to south, I start with Estonia. Estonia has been long under the control of foreign powers, starting with Denmark, then Sweden, and culminating with Russia. Estonia became its own state after World War I, in 1918 or 1917, depending on who you ask, and only 22 years later, it was annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939. The Nordics had virtually no influence on Estonia, but the Soviet Union made much more of an effort to integrate Estonia. 30% of the Estonian population is ethnic Russian, with another 38% using Russian actively. As a whole, as in the entire population, 77% of Estonians are competent in Russian. Russian language skills are generally more useful than Estonian language skills. Belarus and Ukraine have an eternal presence of the Russian language because they are part of the same language family, and they are both written in Cyrillic. Estonia, on the other hand, is part of the Finno-Ugric family and is written in Latin. These differences make maintaining Russian much more difficult, and it appears as though the younger generation is adopting Estonian more readily. 82% of schools use Estonian primarily, with only 14% using Russian. Now, as an aside, Estonian is one of the most complicated languages in the world. Russian is far easier to learn, but it is not really clear whether or not this makes a difference with the re-emergence of Estonian. Now, as you know, most Europeans are bilingual, so Europeans learning two languages is not really foreign to them, so it's like, I don't think that makes much of a difference. The majority of Estonian Russians live in the Narva Peninsula, which has become a point of contention between the two states. Russia wants Narva to be part of Russia, while Estonia doesn't want to lose any of its land. The only organizations holding Russia back are NATO and the EU, but once those are gone, one wonders what sick plans Russia has for Estonia. Millions killed for a tiny piece of land, as horrors beyond comprehension of the other men begin to creep unrelentingly across this once peaceful countryside, turning it into a blood-filled wasteland. To transition to Latvia, I must talk about the law that both Estonia and Latvia have in common. This law prohibits anyone who is not fluent in Estonian or Latvian to become citizens. This means that to this day, around 30% of the Latvian population and 25% of Estonians are not full citizens. From the point of view of these countries, those laws made sense. These monolingual Russian speakers who had an interest in maintaining Russian dominance in these countries would always vote to draw closer to Russia, which was against the interest of native Estonians and Latvians who wanted to become members of NATO and the EU. I could make a comparison to the United States, but that is not too topical for this video. In the past, Germans actually had more of an influence on Latvia than Russia. The Baltic Germans who once lived there were kicked out after World War II, only to be replaced by Russians. Russification hit Latvia the hardest out of the three Baltic states. 28% of Latvians are ethnic Russians, and despite great efforts by Latvia to de-Russify their country, still 42% of Latvians have Russian as their first language. Like in Estonia, Russian language skills hold more value than Latvian, and while I can't back up the next claim with facts, I have read that it's very hard to find a job in Latvia without knowledge of Russian. While not backed up by specific facts, this is backed up by the fact that over 87% of Latvians are competent in Russian. Like Estonian, Latvian is from another language family, this time the Baltic family. And because of that, Russian is harder to maintain. Some people think that the Baltic states should unite in order to maintain their individual independence against larger foreign powers, but a side effect of this would be that Russian would become the language of inter-ethnic communication, forcing Russian to be the prominent language in this Baltic state. Lithuania is the least Russified out of all the states mentioned in this video, and because of this, Lithuania has the ability to treat Russian like they treat any other minority language. 10% of the population speaks Russian as their first language, and ethnic Russians are only 6% of the population. The number of students educated in Russian is even lower, being 4.5%. Russian remains the primary language of communication between Lithuanians and Russians, which is pretty much the only interesting thing of note. The Baltic people in general, talking about all three states, have spent the least amount of time in the Soviet Union and are still very firm about their language being enforced in their countries. Well, I'm not going to speak about any of the Caucasus or Central Asian countries because they aren't really part of Eastern Europe. I know some people may say that Georgia and Armenia are part of Europe, but these people are also dumb and you shouldn't listen to them. Even though I agree that these countries are part of Europe. If I'm going to talk about Russification of these countries, I'll do it in another video. It's always refreshing to see that after decades and even centuries of linguistic oppression, the people of these countries still speak their native languages, with the exception of Belarus, which has gone full Russia mode. What Russia did to these countries was not the prettiest thing to witness, but I also don't hate Russia for forcing Russian onto these populations. Russia, like any other country, did what it had to do in order to perpetuate itself. And there is this idea that industrialization and the internet have made people super easy to assimilate. I disagree with this notion, and I'm leaving this video on a cliffhanger. In the future, I plan to make a video on why most of these modern inventions have had little effect on integration, and why it actually has more to do with economics. This video should be made anywhere between tomorrow and like 10 years from now. I will keep you in suspense like a good movie. And if while researching this topic I end up being wrong, I'll make a video explaining why technology does increase integration. Although this video won't be very entertaining, because of course you already have the reasons lined up, and those reasons are probably right. This is the part where I tell you to subscribe, because apparently YouTube likes it when I do that. Plus, I want to have a massive YouTube channel. YouTubers used to say, subscribe or die, but that's out of fashion now. So how about I say, subscribe or be Russified? Now, that's menacing.